Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you for joining us. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm going to get started here this morning. Good morning and welcome. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm the Vice President of the Stimson Center, as well as the Director of our Conventional Defense Program, which seeks to reduce risk and minimize harm associated with the global arms trade. While I'm always thrilled when Stimson is able to host these sorts of events, I'm especially excited for today's discussion, and not just because of the incredible panel of speakers that we have joining us today. I think the new report that we're launching, Unaccountable, Rethinking U.S. Security Sector Accountability Across the Domestic International Divide, presents an important opportunity to convene a uniquely diverse set of stakeholders and break down the all too familiar silo between those that work on human rights and accountability in the domestic and international spheres. As this report describes the behavior of a country's security institutions, whether that's the military, police, border security, or intelligence services, plays a profound role in shaping the integrity, durability, and faith in the ability to govern. And for a country like the United States, the ability to hold accountable the institutions that are empowered to impose the will of the state through force or coercion is a bedrock principle of our democratic experiment. It's a fundamental check on state power and an indispensable mechanism ensuring that government is in its service of its citizens and not the other way around. Unfortunately, as I think many of us who are joining us today are well aware, the history of the United States in terms of American security institutions is one that has not always lived up to expectations. And while it may be easy to point to a handful of policies, mechanisms, and systems that are meant to support accountability, we are still far short of a cultural and ecosystemic accountability framework that meets the needs and expectations of those harmed at the hands of U.S. security actors. Now, these challenges are shared across the domestic and international divide. And not only is it a disservice to those who suffer harm, but it also poses serious threat to the health of America's democracy and the legitimacy of its institutions. So whether at home or abroad, accountability for American security institution is not and cannot be a box-checking exercise, nor can it be satisfied by process alone. So to do this right, we have to start with the needs, the expectations, the experiences, and demands of those who have consistently been subjects of harm by U.S. security institutions. It's why I'm so pleased that we have had the opportunity to partner with the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, who have authored this incredible report that takes a holistic look at the current state of accountability for U.S. security institutions and how accountability as a value can be elevated and strengthened at every level of government and respond to those most affected by accountability failures. So to help us unpack this complex topic and contextualize how a lack of accountability creates real-world challenges, we're joined today by some exceptional panelists. First, we're very privileged to be joined by Congressman Jason Crow. Congressman Crow has represented Colorado's 6th District since 2019 and serves on the House's Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, its Armed Services Committee, its Small Business Committee. Congressman Crow himself is a former Army Ranger and Bronze Star recipient who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And in addition to a number of priorities, Congressman Crow has long worked to support veterans both in Colorado and in Congress. For the purposes of our discussion, it's probably important to note that Congressman Crow introduced 2 pieces of legislation to further U.S. accountability: the Protection of Civilians in Military Operations Act and the Department of Defense Civilian Harm Transparency Act. And both of these pieces of legislation aim to address longstanding shortcomings in how the United States prevents, mitigates, and responds to civilian harm. Next, we're also joined by Hina Shamsi, who's the director of the ACLU National Security Project, where she works to ensure that U.S. national security policies and practices comply with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. She is engaged in litigation, research, policy advocacy, and congressional testimony on issues including the freedoms of speech and association, racial and religious discrimination, unlawful uses of force and detention, privacy, surveillance, and torture. And her work really includes a focus on the intersection of national security and counterterrorism policies with international human rights and humanitarian law. And last, but certainly not least, let me introduce Annie Sheo, who is the U.S. Advocacy Director for the Center for Civilians in Conflict, where she leads the organization's work engaging with U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and advocates to improve the protection of civilians in conflict. In addition to being one of the authors of the report we'll discuss in a little while, Annie leads Civic's policy analysis and advocacy around civilian harm implications of the U.S. military operations and security assistance, and building and working with coalitions of like-minded organizations to advance U.S. policies that improve the lives of civilians living in conflict. So you see, we've assembled a top-rate panel of experts to discuss these issues. Before I turn to Congressman Crow, for our audience, you may ask questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. And this is a public on-the-record event, and the recording will be available later that you can share with your colleagues and those if you want to return to it to engage later. So let me turn first to Congressman Crow. Thank you, first of all, so much for joining us today. I know it's a very busy day on the Hill. Obviously, given your own military service, you'll have seen firsthand really the importance of accountability for the U.S. defense sector. So I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what accountability means to you and what it has meant in your experience. In other words, why is accountability so important when it comes to security institutions?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. I appreciate both the Stimson Center and Civic for the invitation, and it's good to be on this panel with Annie and Henna as well. And for the folks listening at home, I apologize. I'm going to have to leave early because I have a Foreign Affairs Committee markup that was moved to this morning. So I have a conflict. I normally would not leave before it's finished, but have to run to that markup. So what accountability means to me, it has been shaped by the frames that I've experienced national security throughout my life. I actually started as an enlisted private in the U.S. Army. At the very, very end of the receiving end of U.S. policy made here in Washington, D.C., I ended up becoming an officer, served as a captain in the Rangers and in special operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan, as you mentioned, and now make policy here in Washington. So I've kind of seen this from a multiple different angles, and I have also experienced during my time in service and in combat the devastating effects of war. And not just on those in uniform fighting the wars, but even more devastating, the impact on local civilian populations in a sense they get caught up in that devastation. And that's something that has stuck with me, frankly, throughout my life. And it's something that I've dedicated to trying to fix and improve. And that's reflected in my work. So I approach my work in kind of three different buckets. The first is the issue of protection of civilians in conflict. I'm one of the co-founders of the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus. I've worked very hard to introduce bills and support bills to create the Center of Excellence within DoD to make it a operational priority to formalize the best practices within the Department of Defense. I've led a letter to the president and the administration to help us seek more clarity on targeting procedures for our direct action counterterrorist programs. Very involved in pushing for enhanced lay vetting for the 1208 and 127 ECHO programs, as well as efforts within the House to halt offensive operations by Saudi Arabia during the war in Yemen as well. The second bucket is the one around transparency. I believe that the more transparency we have that allows policymakers to do their job, that allows folks like you, Rachel, and Annie and Henna to do your jobs and to press for accountability and to ask the tough questions and litigate if necessary. So we need sometimes more information from both an IC and a DoD that's reluctant to do so. So pushing from my perch for more regular reports, more openness about the mistakes that we make operationally, because I firmly believe that transparency around mistakes is not a weakness, it's a strength and allows us to correct those mistakes going forward. It also sends a very important message to the world and to our partners that we're a democracy and we mean it, and we're not willing to hide behind opaqueness. And then the last is the issue of reasserting Congress's role in matters of war and peace, because I also believe that we have strayed very, very far from the structure of our Constitution and the checks and balances on national security since 9/11. And Congress has essentially given a blank check through multiple AUMFs to multiple administrations. And this has been a Democratic problem and a Republican problem. This knows no political boundaries. It's 10 Congresses and 4 administrations under which this has happened. So I'm a believer that we need to actually pull back these AUMFs and start that discussion, that public discussion about what national security means, what the American people want, and how to go about it. And I think what that would do is that will better align our values with our policy priorities and the manner in which we are trying to secure this nation. Because the historic approach that people will allow our alignment, the United States' alignment with unsavory characters, with oppressive regimes in many cases, to advance our own security interests is actually a short-sighted approach that does not work. Not only are there moral and value issues with it, it actually just doesn't work. So we need to have more transparency and a more public discussion about who it is we are partnering with and how we're going to hold them accountable and who we're not going to partner with to achieve our own goals.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you, of course, for your service and also for your continued leadership on this issue. I think it's really important that the recognition that it's not just being accountable for accountability's sake, but really being transparent about what that looks like and what that means. So putting those 2 pieces of legislation forward, I think, really provides sort of a holistic view of some of these issues. And Hina, I want to turn to you because I think your work has really given you a very unique opportunity to look at many of these issues that the Congressman just raised with both a domestic and an international lens. So I'm wondering if you could share how you see accountability issues linked across the domestic international divide, and how does accountability at home here in the United States often affect accountability abroad or vice versa?
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I just need to begin also with thanking you and Annie and Stimson and Civic for this really invaluable report. And I very much urge people to read it. I was going over it last night and early this morning. And Congressman, just wanted to start also with really profound appreciation to you and your staff for your focus on civilian harm and war powers related issues. It is wonderful to see. And we very much appreciate it because you have the ability to help make concrete change. And it's wonderful to see you advance that. So my colleagues and I, yes, we in our work do have the privilege, opportunity, obligation to work on accountability issues across domestic and international contexts. And I think in today's world, those contexts can become very blurred. For example, we're talking about security agencies today. So, NSA surveillance, for example, and surveillance programs that we are concerned about or object to pick up Americans' communications over the internet just as much as they do those of foreigners, right? So we're thinking about security agencies writ large. And here, I think in answering your question, part of what I found so valuable about the report that Stimson and Civic did is that it thinks of accountability as a system, because accountability writ large as a concept can and should mean multiple ways of providing what the Congressman talked about, transparency, which has to go hand in hand with accountability, as well as ensuring various forms of recognition, acknowledgement, amends or reparation or compensation where appropriate. And not only, which is one of the things the report notes, not only what security agencies often think of as accountability, which is just legal liability. And don't get me wrong, legal liability is very important. We work on that. But accountability has to be understood writ large. And that's because when we're talking about security agencies, these are the institutions in our government that generally have maximum power with maximum ability to use coercive tools, actual and threatened violence, and other forms of coercion. And as throughout history and over the past 20 years, what we often have is most powerful agencies working, unfortunately, at times to the detriment of the least powerful people, whether that is communities of color, immigrants at home, or communities impacted by the devastation of war and conflict abroad. So in that way, I think part of what's become really finally acknowledged and understood, perhaps especially in the last 5+ years, is the extent to which state power and lack of accountability are racialized. And I appreciate that your report focuses on that. So I'll end by saying this, because I wanted to sort of contextualize this, that when we're thinking about accountability, I think about it as a spectrum. So you have, on one end of the spectrum, structural accountability, right? So the congressman mentioned this, and I think it's super important: democratic accountability to the American people. And there we have a failure, for example, with respect to war powers, right? The executive has accrued power. Congress has, unfortunately and shamefully, given it away. And when called upon to enforce the roles of branches, the Supreme Court has stepped back. We then have institutions, Congress, IGs, and oversight mechanisms, internal frameworks of accountability that too often have not done their job the way that we want to. And then on the other end of the spectrum, and all of this is really important, and I think the other end is extremely important, are the individuals who experience harm and who have significant barriers to recognition of what they have suffered, access to impact outcomes, to achieve justice, to ensure that harm doesn't happen again, and to prevent these outcomes from going forward in the future. So it's really important to sort of talk about all of those, both across the international and domestic spectrum as well.
Thank you, Hina. I want to remind our audience, if you have any questions for the Congressman or Hina, you may put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. But in the meantime, I want to ask both of you, there seems to be an urgency in your remarks about the things that need to change to allow accountability to sort of permeate through this spectrum that you just described, Hina. I wonder if there are some immediate changes either of you would make to improve accountability for U.S. security institutions. You know, we like here at Stimson to be very tangible and practical and sort of roll our sleeves up. What can we do about this issue? Maybe Congressman, I'll start with you.
Yeah, Rachel, I think I would go back to my issue of war powers and AUMF. I think a lot of folks would be pretty shocked, maybe not the folks on this Zoom who pay close attention to this stuff, but certainly a lot of people back in my district and throughout the country, but the dozens of places in which we have combat operations and troops right now that you never hear about, right? I mean, we started to hear about Somalia. You know, what is our goal there? What are we trying to achieve? Who are we partnering with? What are the guidelines for our operations? You know, these are discussions that are not happening, right? And they're not, well, I'll say this, they're not happening in the right forum, right? And they're not happening publicly. You know, we just spent 20 years at war, thousands dead, tens of thousands dead, devastation for civilian populations, a terrible sacrifice by our uniformed men and women, trillions of dollars of taxpayer money, because years ago we stopped having a conversation about our goals and whether this was winnable in our interests, to be A, in Afghanistan, and B, conducting it in the way that we were conducting it. We have to stop the madness, right? There's no other way to put it. Pull back these AUMFs, that doesn't mean that we just pull back at all of our operations, but replace them with things that have very clear guardrails, with sunset provisions that outline very specifically what the authorities are that we're giving to the administration. And then when the administration wants to do something, then they come to Congress and they seek additional authority to do it. And we have a conversation about whether or not we will support that. And my constituents and the American people are behind it, and it's aligned with our values. That would be, in my view, one of the single most important things we could do right now.
Thank you. Hannah?
Let me just pick up where the congressman left off, because largely in agreement in that there are specific measures that can be taken. So legislation's been introduced in the House and Senate, reining in the executive's war power. And I think we need to have that conversation, critically importantly, to right size how this power is exercised and who is accountable for it. In conjunction with a conversation about what authorizations are in fact legitimate going forward. And I very much agree that any new AUMF would need to have a lot of guardrails. We've learned a lot of lessons in the last 20 years. But what I would hope is that alongside those specific measures, we have a conversation about redefining security, so that it is, unfortunately, it seems to me that too often the security that we've been focused on is the security of the security agencies. So, the security from oversight or accountability or change, as opposed to human security, the populations that are impacted. So the reconceptualization of what security is in this context, conversation that's happening, long overdue. Your report helps advance this conversation, and I appreciate that. I think there are other structural changes and issues that we need to also focus on domestically, and probably we'll get to some of those aspects a little bit later. But another thing that a lot of people don't know about is that we have in this country a policy on bias and preventing bias on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, and so on in domestic federal law enforcement and intelligence gathering that actually contains loopholes allowing for bias in the national and homeland security contexts. Now, President Biden has issued a policing executive order that essentially says to the Justice Departments and Departments of Justice and Homeland Security, what needs to change? Tell me what we need to change. And that, I think, is critical and long overdue. Communities of color, civil society in this country have for decades wanted to eliminate bias in law enforcement and intelligence. You see the rejuvenated, it's always been there because communities of color have had this conversation, rejuvenated conversation about policing, but this also needs to apply to national and homeland security. And there are concrete policy mechanisms to start eliminating bias in the way that it should be.
Thanks, Hannah. And I hope we can maybe touch on one more aspect before the congressman has to leave, because I think it sort of follows on from what you were just saying and what this report is trying to do in terms of how can the federal government promote accountability, not just internationally, but also at the state and local level. During this process of writing this report, we did interviews with constituencies within the United States and found many similarities with their experiences with security institutions that we were uncovering internationally as well. So I'm wondering what that might look like at the federal level. Congressman?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't separate the two, obviously, right? I mean, they're flip sides of the same coin. As Hannah started to mention the impacts on bias, on community policing, and how they're all tied together with our external security policies and apparatus, and internal as well. A couple of things I would mention is one is getting our national security infrastructure to be more transparent and to engage directly with the American people, right? There just isn't a culture of engagement and transparency within the U.S. national security infrastructure. part and parcel to that is actually getting folks who actually are more reflective of our community. The lack of diversity within the national security and foreign policy sphere is pretty stunning, frankly. Still, you look at most of the people in the upper levels, and these are people that I think are phenomenal. I mean, no hit on them. A lot of them are close friends of mine and do great work, but they're really not reflective of this country right now. So making sure that we're promoting that pipeline and getting people from more diverse backgrounds, more diverse experiences into our national security is extremely important. And then there are programs like, Section 702, which is, we have the FISA reauthorization up this year. That authority expires. There have been some historic challenges with abuses of that program. I've been in discussions with the FBI and the IC community about that. I believe that they're moving in the right direction. I believe they've made very strong changes, but there has to be more engagement and more transparency. And I am somebody that falls on the spectrum of supporting reauthorization of that program with proper checks and with a continued emphasis on making changes to prevent abuses that we have seen in the past, or misuses might be the best way to put it. So that's a conversation that we're going to have in Congress. It's going to be a really important conversation, but it's a key area for accountability going forward. And it just underscores what we've been talking about, is the need for more information and more regular information in a very systematic way from the agencies that are implementing that program, so we can actually have that conversation in the way that we need to have it.
Thank you, Congressman. Hannah?
It won't surprise you that I have a list of issues, depending on what exactly that we're talking about. But let me just pick up on what the Congressman said about 702, because it was just last week, actually, that the Supreme Court declined to hear a lawsuit that we had filed on behalf of Wikimedia and other entities challenging 702. And here, I think part of what we've been talking about is a failure of institutions, right? The court has written itself out of the role of weighing in, and other courts have as well, of weighing in on some of the most consequential policies. And I say consequential both in terms of scope of powers claimed and consequences for the individuals as well, which is this 702, which is mass warrantless surveillance of Americans and foreigners, phone calls and text messages and emails and electronic communications. This is information that can be gathered and used to prosecute and imprison people, even for crimes that have nothing to do with national security. And so I think this is one of the themes that you see, not just in the last 20 years, for example, but throughout American history, which is this notion that something that security agencies feel the actual or perceived need to do in the name of security for a particular reason expands, and rarely is reined in, which is part of the reason that it is critically important, especially with the Supreme Court declining to hear the challenge to 702, that the attention now turns to the reauthorization debate that is coming up by the end of, has already started. This is one place where, Congressman, you and I are going to depart, which is we don't think 702 should be reauthorized, but as part of that debate, there needs to be significantly more transparency. My colleagues have filed FOIA lawsuits seeking more information about what has been authorized. We're still waiting and waiting. And real important constraints, because part of what ends up happening is debates and oversight end up too often leaving more latitude instead of constraining it. And now I know that the Congressman needs to leave, so I'm going to stop, but maybe we can continue this.
And I do have it a lot. I'm being told I have a little bit of extra time that I'll be pulled by my staff when I need to go. I'm good right now.
Great. No, I appreciate that, Congressman, because I think, there are, I really like this notion, Hina, of the spectrum, right? When we look at accountability, there are different elements, there are different constituencies involved, there are different constituencies affected. And so I think it's really important that we have a variety of approaches, right? This is not sort of, I said at the beginning, it's not a box checking exercise, but there's also not just one box, right? We have many different opportunities to influence the process and to make systemic changes, as well as sort of adopting sort of a different mindset when it comes to accountability. And so I wonder, and maybe this will help as the congressman's departing, sort of what are some of the tangible things that you're focused on addressing this year to improve accountability for U.S. security institutions? So we mentioned the War Powers Act, of course, and some reinvigorated debates on the Hill and sort of in the public and even in the courts. But are there some specific things that you're focused on trying to accomplish in the next year, Congressman?
Yeah, Rachel, there are. So I was a driving force behind the creation of the Afghanistan War Commission, because I believe this needs to be a nonpartisan, holistic look at 20 years of failures and missteps that have caused irreparable harm in many cases, not just to our national security and our reputation, but people's lives and devastation over a vast swath of the Middle East. And we just can't do it again, right? We just can't afford to do something like that again. And there's a lot of reasons why I think this was allowed to go on for as long as it did, without the conversation that we need to have. So that War Commission needs to be built out. It needs to get moving fast. I'm pushing for additional funding for it, for staffing for it. I'm working with the co-chairs who are phenomenal people, Colin and Shamila, to make sure that that gets done and it gets done fast. Second is I was just named the ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is going to be the epicenter of the review of Afghanistan, as well as Ukraine aid as well. And one of the things that I'm very concerned about is not just accountability for U.S. weapons and assistance, but there are vast amounts, and I know the Stimson Center is probably tracking this, but vast amounts of Russian equipment and arms, weapons, that are tied up on the battlefield that we're concerned are being diverted, right? This is stuff that's been left behind, it's been abandoned. There's no accountability over these weapons whatsoever, and very easily could start showing up in places around the world. So trying to figure out how we get our arms around what is that proliferation concern as well. And then building out this center of excellence. This is a focus of the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus. But we did pass our legislation to codify the CHIMRAP, as it's called. Defense Secretary Austin is a firm supporter of the CHIMRAP, and he moved on his own to do this, but we coupled that with codifying it as well, creating the Center of Excellence. We got $42 million in the appropriations cycle last year to actually fund it and stand it up. I want to see it implemented. I want to see it staffed in the right way with a sufficiently senior person that actually can go into the Pentagon and make sure that this is implemented, because the Pentagon is all about seniority. It's all about who has sway and power, and we have to make sure that the right person with the right level of seniority is in that role, so it's taken seriously and it actually has some heft to move the momentum of that building in the direction that it needs to move. So we're going to be focusing very hard on that effort as well.
Thank you. And Congressman, if you do need to leave while Hina is speaking, we very much understand and really appreciate your leadership and your continued service to these issues, and look forward to continuing to work with you in the future to see these ideas move sort of beyond sort of the rhetoric and into the implementation phase, which I think is really important. We have a lot of nice words about these issues, but when we'd like to see also the action that happens. So Hina, maybe I'll ask the same question of you. Sort of, what are the tangible things you'd like to focus on or see in the next year?
So I've already talked about the 702 reauthorization. Let me give you a few more key issues. So we've been talking about unaccountable uses of force abroad, and one thing that is still with us is unlawful detention and unfair trials at Guantanamo. We're now down to 32 people left there. Guantanamo continues to be a legal, ethical, moral stain on this country and our conscience. And there is a path, and I really think we're moving closer towards it, to closure this year, and certainly by the end of the Biden administration. So the vast majority of men currently held at Guantanamo have been cleared for transfer or release by security and intelligence agencies, some for decades. There is no good reason that the Biden administration cannot prioritize, focus on moving them out, coordinating with other countries abroad, because Congress put in place in 2010 legislation that prevents people from being brought to the United States, including for medical purposes, actually. So moving towards closure is, moving expeditiously towards closure is a focus. And here I think, this is not something I ever thought I would say, but I commend an op-ed by Ted Olson, who was President Bush's Solicitor General, and more importantly, a 9/11 family member. And I think he's written a really important and courageous op-ed expressing essentially his acknowledgement and regrets for why we have not been able to have a measure of justice from the Guantanamo military commissions. And he is saying that he would be okay with plea agreements that take the death penalty off the table for those who are being prosecuted for capital trials at Guantanamo in return for life imprisonment. And what's also incredible to see is 9/11 family members, and incredible in sort of that way that you acknowledge like human generosity and warmth, saying, we want the death penalty taken off the table. And the plea process would allow us to get transparency in a way that we have not yet been able to do. And so that those measures are important and laid out. Another thing that I think will be really important, I talked about the guidance on race that was implemented in 2014 under the Obama administration, bias in domestic operations, but I want to focus on what those mean. So this is a policy that impacts everything from watch listing, which is a scourge for communities of color in this country, to surveillance, vetting, investigation, border detentions, and questioning. So concretely eliminating loopholes that allow for bias profiling in national and homeland security will get us much further towards the country that we want to be, not the country that we currently are.
Thank you, Hannah. Congressman, do you have time for one more question?
I do, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to take advantage of you being here, and I recognize for our audience, it's a little odd that we haven't talked about the report that we're talking about, but we will get to it, I promise. I just want to take advantage of having the Congressman with us. I wonder, Congressman, if you can talk about what you see as the link between U.S. accountability for our own actions domestically and how that impacts our ability to promote accountability abroad, for example, in Ukraine or other locations. So just sort of an open question about that linkage that we're trying to make in the report and the importance of that.
Yeah, the report does a wonderful job of outlining that because they are completely tied, right? I do a lot of traveling overseas, congressional delegation visits, meeting with members of foreign parliaments, civil activists, civil society leaders throughout the world, as well as heads of state. And what they all say is that our word carries less weight, our example carries less weight when we don't have our own house in order, right? And it's hard for us to promote democracy and freedom and human rights when we have issues of police abuse, when we have issues of bias, systematic bias and racism within our institutions that we haven't dealt with, fully and honestly and candidly. And listen, I was involved with January 6th, right? I was one of those members of Congress who was trapped in the House gallery on January 6th. And never in a million years that I think that as a member of Congress in the year 2021 that I would be trapped by a riotous mob in the United States Capitol, fueled by misinformation and disinformation and weaponized by the former president. But it happened, right? And the world saw it, we saw it. And it certainly was a shock wave because we never thought it would happen here. Of course, the great lesson and the silver lining of that, if there is one, is that we realize the fragility of democracy. We realize the fragility of our own systems. And it allows us to have a more honest and candid conversation about our own house needing to get in order. But they absolutely have to be addressed. I mean, I am the person who represented Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain was a constituent of mine. And I'm still very close with his mother. And we have an issue where the largest police department in my district is under a consent decree right now with the Colorado Attorney General's office for police abuse issues. So this is very, very real in my district and my community. I see it, I hear it. There isn't a day when I'm back home where I'm not hearing concerns from communities that I represent, parents, teachers, et cetera, where they need and demand action. And that's why I've co-sponsored and helped push the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I'm pushing efforts to ban the use of ketamine by law enforcement and also implement 7 of the Obama 21st Century in Policing Task Force recommendations that go towards police recruiting, police training. And this is an area where there's a direct tie between what we have to do within our national security infrastructure in the Department of Defense and what we have to do to reform policing in America. Not only do we need transparency, which of course will drive accountability, but we also need to change the manner in which we're recruiting and who we're recruiting and who we're putting into these forces and how we're training them and how we're preparing them in the culture and the mindset that we set for not only our local domestic police forces, but also our military and our intelligence personnel as well. It's really the same challenge.
Thank you, Congressman, for reminding us this is at the root about people, right? Whether it's our own experiences or the people that are impacted by the lack of accountability. And I wonder, Hannah, with your experience representing different constituencies and humans around the world, right? And seeing firsthand how unaccountability is affecting them and their lives. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, about sort of at that human level. What is the impact of a lack of accountability?
Yeah, well, starting with the human level, I just want to return to something the Congressman started with, which is to acknowledge your leadership and courage on January 6th. I looked at those photos, I read those accounts, so I just wanted to pause and say thank you to you there. Let me start back again with that spectrum, right? Sticking with the human. We have a record in this country, unfortunately, of elevating and lauding people who violated or infringed on people's rights. What would we say to another country where the head of the Foreign Intelligence Agency is someone who oversaw torture and had a role in the destruction of torture evidence? That's what Gina Haspel did, and she became the head of the CIA in 2018. So when we're talking about failures of accountability, I feel like we also need to talk about who is promoted, right? Your report talks about the few bad apples, like in England for Abu Ghraib and so on, when actually there are part of what's so important, it seems to me, for accountability with respect to security institutions is something that I focused on early in my career as a younger lawyer, which is command responsibility, right? That notion of senior leadership's responsibility in setting an example. But that's not actually what we've done, at least with some of the most cataclysmic policies like torture and so on. But very much wanting to center the impact on individuals that my colleagues and I have the privilege and responsibility of representing. The history, use lethal force as an example, of lethal force accountability. And I'm not talking about legal liability alone. I'm talking about basic things like acknowledgement that civilians were harmed, apology. A lot of times what people want is that recognition and apology and then amends in an appropriate way that includes the fact, and this has now been documented for years, there's not just a physical toll of the use of lethal force outside of recognized wars as well as in wars, there is a tremendous psychological toll. I'm representing clients, of one of the one of the recent instances that got a lot of, we've lost the congressman, I imagine he had to go. Let me just finish this out, Rachel. The use of lethal force against an aid worker and his family members, 10 people altogether at the end of the US withdrawal in Afghanistan. And my clients are unusual in that their case got a lot of attention, thankfully, but due in part to themselves, because they had to stand up and become public to prove themselves innocent of a false accusation, which in turn caused their security to be at risk. We are, to this day, including before this call, working on evacuating our clients out of dangerous contexts. And here I really need to acknowledge the State and Defense Department officials, the one-on-one people who are working day by day with us on this, while at the same time calling out the institutional failures that led to this happening in the first place, that have led to a lack of acknowledgement and amends and compensation to far too many other people over the last 15, 16 years. And the need for the kind of systemic reform that your report and Congressman were talking about. So I'll stop there and hopefully we can talk about the report.
Yes, thank you. I think that's actually what, this conversation I think has been really fascinating, not only just from a sort of practical standpoint, but also because it highlighted so many of the issues within this report. And I think it is time to turn to the report, because I think we've tried to take a very complex issue and have a very ambitious report that seeks to address some of the issues that we've been talking about today. So Annie, I'm hoping that you can give us an overview of what the report's key findings were and some of the resulting recommendations for policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels, many of which we've touched on sort of in this conversation, but sort of the framework that this report outlines.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel. And huge thanks again. Thank you, Hina, for joining us. Thank you, Congressman Crow and his team for joining us as well, and to everyone who's watching. So normally, as Rachel noted, I would have presented the report at the beginning, but this actually turned out really perfectly because Hina and Congressman Crow made many of the points I was going to make for me. So I'm really glad to hear so many of our findings reaffirmed. I will try not to spend too long reiterating those points, but now that the report is out, Elias just put the link in the chat. Before you all hopefully go take a look, I just want to put some of those findings in context. So as you noted, Rachel, the project really set out to evaluate the current state of accountability for US security institutions across what we've kind of referred to as this domestic international divide. We wanted to understand what common features existed between accountability records of US security institutions at home and abroad, and why those commonalities existed, and also what that meant for the common experiences of the people who were trying to seek accountability for harm, right? What barriers were they facing in seeking accountability? What were the consequences, as Hina just laid out, for those accountability failures? And then also, what does comprehensive accountability actually mean to those people? So to do that, we spoke with people from impacted communities across the United States, including at the US-Mexico border in San Diego and Tijuana, and the Minneapolis Twin Cities area, and then also internationally in places where the US has conducted military operations. Now, it's important to recognize, and we do in the report, that the context within which law enforcement and the military are operating domestically and internationally are different, as are oftentimes the domestic and international legal frameworks that govern their conduct. But despite those differences, we did see really significant commonalities in victims and survivors' experiences trying to seek accountability for harm, regardless of whether or not the security force conduct in question was lawful or unlawful. So I do want to note from the start, as Hina noted as well, that this research really sought to address and include, but also go beyond questions about criminal accountability for individual unlawful conduct in order to really reimagine what comprehensive accountability for harm might and should entail, regardless of legality or perpetrator, and with victims and survivors at the center. So again, to Hina's point, that legal piece is important, but also expanding beyond that. And so with that premise, I will lay out just a few of our key findings and recommendations. The first is very simple. It's that accountability matters, right? It matters to the victims and survivors of harm. It reaffirms their humanity. It can provide comfort and closure, and it can support physical and psychological healing. It can also critically prevent future harm from recurring. And then, of course, we also found that beyond that focus on individuals and communities, accountability is also really critical to democratic governance and public trust, and to U.S. credibility internationally, as our panelists noted today. Despite these undeniable benefits of accountability, we also found, though, that across this domestic-international divide, people harmed in U.S. security activities still shared similar challenges in trying to get that necessary accountability. So those challenges included things like barriers to accessing certain mechanisms, starting with the variability to safely report harm when it happens, selectivity in terms of who gets accountability and who doesn't. So, for example, a focus on cases that maybe have higher levels of media attention, or focusing on holding so-called bad apples accountable, as well as selectivity, which Congressman Crow noted, in terms of how the U.S. pursues accountability abroad, right? Focusing on accountability for adversaries, but maybe not for allies. We also found limitations in existing legal accountability tools, poor oversight mechanisms, and bureaucratic red tape, some of the things I think that Hina noted as well earlier on. Another finding was that accountability has real consequences. This is something that Hina just spoke to really clearly, first and foremost, consequences for the victims and survivors of harm, but also in terms of how accountability failures, again, erode public trust in governance, fuel cycles of harm internationally, and complicate international accountability efforts. The last thing is that we consulted a wide range of literature on accountability and also, again, spoke to impacted communities about what accountability can and should actually mean. And what we found is that people envisioned a comprehensive system of accountability that encompasses various elements, not just punitive measures, that really center on victims' needs and desires. So people talked about the power of acknowledging harm, of offering explanations of what happened and why, and offering real apologies for harm. They talked about the importance of states taking responsibility for harm caused, including, again, by offering monetary amends or reparations for harm. And they also talked again about legal liability, as well as other forms of disciplinary action when legal liability may not apply or be appropriate. And then there was also one other really important element of accountability that came up over and over again, and that was what we refer to as non-repetition, right? So preventing harm from recurring. People were very clear that accountability is not just what happens after harm, but it's also the responsibility to prevent future harm through systemic change, right? Because accountability cannot bring back a lost loved one. So naturally, our first recommendation then for the US government was to embrace a comprehensive and systemic approach to accountability that offers a range of options centered around the needs and preferences of victims and survivors, and that includes non-repetition as a key element. I won't go through every recommendation here, but just to highlight a few more broad aspects. Security institutions operating domestically and internationally also need better ways for people to safely report harm, better procedures for independent and transparent investigations into harm. And that also has to include not just fixing procedures for the future, but also reckoning with past harms, including by reinvestigating cases that were probably erroneously dismissed due to shortcomings in past investigations. So, for example, we at Civic and many of our partners have been urging the US Defense Department to reopen investigations into credible instances of civilian harm that were likely dismissed before the development of the new civilian harm mitigation and response action plan that will, hopefully fix those issues in the future. And then again, as the US works to improve its own accountability practices, it also has to be much more consistent in how it supports and promotes accountability abroad. So again, that means supporting accountability not only for adversaries, but also and especially for close allies, and also recommending that the US finally join the International Criminal Court. Lastly, and across all of the accountability mechanisms and efforts that we recommend in the report, it is critical that the US government center and consult with impacted communities to understand what accountability means to them, to the people who have borne the brunt of harm. So I will stop there, but we really welcome questions about the report. Any last questions for Hina in our last few moments? And thank you all so much again.
Thanks, Annie. I really want to encourage our audience to look at this report. There's a lot there. There are a lot of really, I think, essential findings that would facilitate accountability at both, at the local level, at the state level, the national level, but also internationally. Again, not just for the United States, but sort of with the partners and allies that we work with. So I think I cannot commend this report strongly enough, because I think it really does take a very complicated set of issues and break it down into a very approachable, tangible way forward for potential solutions. Given the short amount of time that we have left, I want to turn to both of you sort of for some final thoughts about this issue and sort of about the way forward. So Hina, let me start with you.
Thanks, Rachel. And because time is short, I wonder if I can just pick up on a couple of themes that are coming up in the questions from our audience that focus on the importance of recognizing the impact of history and what I think of as the President Obama look forward, not backward approach, as well as the linkages between domestic and international. And so I think three things stand out for me. One is that you can't move forward without understanding where you went wrong. Feels like parents say this to kids, our leaders, policymakers should understand this when they're looking at systemic issues. And so it is critically important in looking at civilian harm lessons to, for example, and the success of the CHIMRAP going forward, that we look back to what went wrong and what needs to be done more systematically. Second is that the linkages between domestic and international that policymakers might be waking up to have always been known by the impacted communities, right? We are a nation of immigrants and diaspora connected to, just to take one example, communities connected to places in which conflicts and wars are occurring. We know and we see, and I'll use myself as an example, that the kinds of places I come from or lived in South Asia or various, Southern Africa and elsewhere, what the US is doing there, we know about. And we connect it to the ways in which unaccountable violence is perpetrated on communities of color in a racialized way. And there are exciting connections happening in civil society to recognize the dangers of militarization, lack of accountability. I want to see those grow. That's a lot of where change, I think, comes from. And the final thing I will say is, you point out in your report that accountability can be an amorphous term, right? And part of what ends up happening is these sort of, especially with policymakers or security institutions, these amorphous debates. Well, what about this and what about that? We can't do this, we can't do that. And what there's not enough of a focus on is a will to actually act with the numerous tools available. And that's part of the shift that we need. And with every single issue that has come up in this conversation and that your report addresses, there are pathways, there are concrete ways to move forward, and it can be done.
Thank you, Hina. I'm going to ask our audience to indulge us to go over just a few minutes, because I want to give the floor to Annie and to answer some of the questions that have been posed in the chat. I recognize we're not going to get to all of them. In some ways, that's great. We've spurred a conversation that we want to see continue. But Annie, if you could touch on a few that are in the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will be really quick, especially because I mostly just want to reiterate some of the things that Hina said, which also connect to a question that was in the chat about those civil society connections. I've already laid out some of our recommendations for the US government, who are, of course, the primary duty bearers here. But the other really interesting piece of the report for me was implications for civil society and for how we connect and build movements. Because so much of what this report has shown for us is that these silos of domestic and foreign policy, especially when it comes to this issue of accountability, that's in so many ways a superficial divide. And so one thing that we're also, excited to do more of, and of course there are some groups that have already been doing this and making these connections, but to kind of build on that and really be able to work more across this divide, make those connections much more explicit in our advocacy and our analysis, and be able to push for, again, this comprehensive accountability that goes beyond this divide and includes the plethora of security institutions that are causing harm domestically and internationally. So that is also the thought that I would leave everyone with.
Thank you, Annie and Hina. I really want to extend a heartfelt thank you to both of you and to Congressman Crow, not only for your powerful remarks today, but really for your leadership and guidance in how to do better, how to affect positive change in the world and for the people that are affected by injustice and a lack of accountability. We could have this event. I mean, the questions that we're seeing in the chat are really fascinating about gender implications and protection of civilians around the world. We could have, hours of conversation on these topics. And so I encourage those of you here to share this report widely, to engage in conversations with relevant stakeholders and affected constituencies and communities so that we can see this positive change. I really I'm not naive enough after almost 30 years in Washington to think this change is going to happen overnight. I think this report and this conversation really clearly lays out some of the essential first steps that get us down that path towards greater accountability for US security institutions across this domestic and international divide. And I personally look forward to working with Hina and Annie and so many of you in the future to make progress towards those priorities. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking this hour of your very early morning to share in this process with us. And we are available and happy to answer any questions about the report and about these issues more broadly in the future. So thanks for joining us today and have a safe and resilient day.